He thought he owned the deal, but he never checked who owned the entity. By the time he opened that VP email, it was already too late. The sun didn't rise that morning. It clicked. Cold, blue LED light flickered to life across the open floor as I pushed through the glass door with my elbow, coffee in one hand, badge swinging. The office was dead silent. Mondays in our industry started like courtrooms before a verdict. I dropped my tote next to the desk, opened my laptop, and before the Outlook spinner could stop spinning, a new email blinked at the top. Subject: Contracts, urgent, from Trent M., VP, Strategic Expansion. Trent never emailed me directly. He barked in Slack, appeared in Zoom calls like a shadow behind glass, always CCing 4 others. Never just me. Need all signed contracts on Drive, missing ownership details, consolidating for board review. No please, no hi. Just a corporate bark, the kind that smells like gasoline before a fire. 2 sips into my lukewarm latte, I clicked reply. Then I paused, because those contracts weren't in their Drive. They were tied to my client entity. 2 years ago, before this startup even had an office, I built that client funnel from a shaky Notion board and 2 late-night cold calls. No budget, no brand, no legal team. Just me, and the quiet fire of someone with too much to prove. I wrote the proposals, I closed the calls, I structured the deliverables, and when legal finally came around, I made sure those contracts had the only 3 words that mattered: client entity, Oryx LLC, my LLC. They wanted the revenue. But the ownership? That lived on my side of the dotted line. I scrolled through the folder Trent linked. A mess, duplicates, half-signed PDFs, some contracts with metadata stripped, and none of them, none, with the client entity field filled in. Classic. And then the kicker. One contract, the biggest deal we'd ever closed, was missing entirely. Gone. That deal alone accounted for 38% of projected Q4 revenue, and the only clean, signed version lived on my Drive, under my entity, with full version history. 3 clicks later, I opened my folder and hovered over the file. Oryx-redline-signed _final _oct21 PDF time-stamped watermarked legal-reviewed. I didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, I scheduled a Zoom with Trent. Subject line: ownership review. Clarification. Call time: 11 a.m. By 10:58, he was already in the waiting room. By 11:02, I'd flipped the balance of power. He opened with his usual. So, I'm gonna need those contracts, I cut in, polite but sharp. They're tied to my entity, not the general Drive. His brow tightened. What does that mean? It means, I said, pulling up the file, that this deal was built under my LLC. I onboarded them. I signed them. The legal structure is separate, and per policy, that entity owns the contract until a formal transfer is approved. His voice dropped half an octave. Why wasn't this escalated to legal? It was, I smiled. 10 months ago. See the attached thread. I forwarded the original legal escalation email. With his name on CC, he never opened it. Now the consequences were glowing on my screen, 1 pixel at a time. The Drive was missing the files, but Trent was about to lose something far bigger. Trent didn't speak for a full 7 seconds, long enough to betray fear, not strategy, the kind of silence you hear in a courtroom before the jury walks in. I watched him recalibrate, eyes darting slightly off camera, probably skimming through Slack or Gmail for some thread he should have read a year ago. But the damage was already done. Okay, he exhaled finally, voice low, like a man who just realized the safe is empty. We need to realign on ownership. This can't block board prep. I smiled the way you do when someone's 15 minutes late to their own rescue. That's why I suggested the call. Happy to walk you through the contract chain. I shared screen. Opened the folder. Oryx LLC to client contracts to 2023 Q4. Here's the full audit trail, I said, clicking through. Each file signed, each timestamp verified. Client entity field is filled as Oryx LLC across all documents. Legal confirmed the structure. Here's the VP email from your predecessor authorizing it. I opened another tab, a forwarded email from June last year. Subject, Entity Autonomy Approval. Signed, VP Strategic Expansion, K. Flores. Not just approval, delegation. Trent's jaw tensed. This wasn't briefed to me. That's unfortunate, I said, but it's fully documented. I can loop in legal again if you'd prefer a formal reconfirmation. For a moment, I thought he might snap, raise his voice, threaten escalation. But instead, he changed tone, syrupy, dangerous. Look, no one's trying to undermine your work. We just need centralized access and… Understood, I nodded, but didn't budge. That would require a transfer of ownership, formally signed and approved by legal. Until then, my entity remains the holder. He froze. The word ownership always hits like a glass of cold water in rooms run by power-hungry VPs. 10 minutes later, he ended the call with a tight smile and vague promises. Let's regroup next week. Appreciate the clarity. But clarity wasn't what he wanted. He wanted control, and he didn't get it. At 4:12 p.m., I received a new email. Subject, Contract Structure Concern. From Trent MCC, Legal Ops Finance. He tried to go around me, claiming obscure filing and ambiguous structure. But I'd prepared for this move. At 4:37, I replied with a simple PDF. Oryx Contract Filing Summary. Ownership and timeline.pdf, every signature, every approval. And the final page, a screenshot of the internal approval Slack thread with Trent's emoji reaction. 5:15 p.m. My inbox pinged again. From Legal Subject, Contract Structure Concern. Confirmed, ownership is contractually bound to Oryx LLC. No transfer possible without written consent from entity owner. And just like that, the circle closed. The board was scheduled for Friday. But now, they wouldn't be reviewing growth. They'd be reviewing who lost control of 38% of revenue. Ever had to prove your ownership when someone tried to erase it? Comment ownership if you've been there, or if you've seen it happen in silence. The next morning felt still. Not calm, still. The kind of quiet that follows a slammed door or precedes a storm. I stepped into the office early. Too early. The cleaning crew was still there, muffled vacuum noise humming through the hall like distant static. But I needed to see the screen before anyone else did, because the board meeting was today. And I knew Trent would try to spin the narrative before the receipts caught up. At 8:06 a.m., the company-wide Slack pinged. Board prep files updated. Please check today's folder for final decks. Ops team. I clicked fast, navigated through Drive to Board Meeting to Q4 Review. First red flag, the contract's slide, the one I built, was missing. Second, a new slide, Revenue Attribution and Entity Structure prepared by Strategic Expansion. I opened it and stared. Trent had built a new diagram, one that moved the client entity block from Oryx LLC to Parent Co. Internal Holdings. A complete fabrication. For 3 heartbeats, I did nothing. Then I opened my own slide deck, the one from last quarter's review. Slide 14, Client Entity, Oryx LLC Contract Filing, Confirmed by legal, see memo ID number 431-B, attached below, a signed memo from legal, one I'd uploaded 3 months ago, and one still timestamped in the system. He hadn't just ignored it, he'd replaced it. At 8:23 a.m., I took my next step. Opened Outlook, drafted a single-line email. Subject, board slide discrepancy. Entity ownership. Per prior filings, please refer to legal memo number 431-B and audit summary, sent October 12th. Edits in current deck may reflect inaccurate attribution. Attached the PDF, attached the Slack screenshot, attached the time-stamped deck, sent it to legal, CFO, CEO, and the board liaison. CC, Trent, no emotion, just evidence. At 9:11 a.m., a new email appeared. Subject, slide update request, board packet Q4, from CEO's executive assistant. Please disregard strategic expansions edits on entity attribution. Original structure will be restored prior to board presentation. No apology. But I didn't need one. The slide had been quietly pulled, replaced with mine, time-stamped, watermarked, verified. And Trent? He went silent on Slack. For the first time in 6 months, by Wednesday the tone across the office had shifted, subtly, like a draft under a closed door. Nobody said Trent's name aloud, but the silence around him rang louder than gossip ever could. The strategic expansion pod stopped pushing updates. Slack threads dried up. Even Zoom invites had a new default host. But I wasn't celebrating, not yet. Because when men like Trent lose control in public, they reach for control in private. And I was waiting for the next move. It came on Thursday, late, 6:46 p.m. Subject, reassignment of accounts, internal realignment. From Trent M., CC, HR, Ops, Legal, 3 clients, all under Oryx, all marked for transition to internal management. It looked sterile, but it read like retaliation. I didn't reply. I escalated. At 7:12 p.m., I opened a new thread. Subject, client transfer request, ownership concern. Contracts tied to Oryx LLC require formal agreement prior to any transfer. Per legal memo number 431-B, such action without consent constitutes breach. Attached, original contracts, entity filings, legal summary, VP email from Flores, time-stamped Slack with Trent's reaction. Friday morning, 8:03 a.m., legal replied. Fast. Confirmed, no client transfer may occur without entity approval. Operations instructed to hold. 10 minutes later, a second email. Subject, HR inquiry, entity boundaries and retaliation. From Internal Affairs. It was starting, not a defense, an audit. At 10:14 a.m., my phone buzzed. Caller ID unknown. I picked up. Hi, a clipped voice said. This is Maya from Internal Affairs. We'd like a brief Zoom, confidential review, nothing formal yet. Of course, we scheduled it for 2 p.m., and I spent the next 4 hours digging into old emails, meeting notes, Slack messages where Trent casually used phrases like "get them under our umbrella" and "nobody owns the client forever." But I did, at least contractually. At 2:01 p.m., I clicked into the Zoom. Maya's square blinked on. Neutral background, legal pads, the face of a woman who's heard every excuse and still shows up sharp. We've received documentation indicating possible overreach in strategic expansion, she began, and potential breaches of contract attribution. Can you walk us through the timeline? Oh, I could. I opened the files and started from the beginning. Maya didn't blink once during my walkthrough. She didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't nod. But I saw her pen pause at key moments, right when Trent's quotes crossed into policy violations. and especially when I pulled up the VP email from K Floors, the one that no one ever seemed to remember until it burned. By the time I finished, she had 5 pages of notes and 2 bookmarked attachments. "We'll need to follow up," she said calmly. "This isn't the first attribution issue flagged from strategic expansion." "Not the first? Interesting." "Will there be a formal review?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "There will," she said. "You won't be required in the initial phase." But I knew what that meant. Someone would be. The next day, Slack was eerily quiet again. No posts in #client-dev. No movement from Trent's side, not even a passive-aggressive emoji. And then, at 2:49 p.m., the first domino dropped. Trent M. has been removed from the Strategic Expansion Slack channel. No fanfare, no memo, just deleted. 30 minutes later, a new calendar invite appeared. Subject, Entity Ownership Process Review. Host, Legal and Ops attendees, me, CFO, HR, CEO. The subject line said, Review, but the people said, War Room. I entered the meeting 5 minutes early. CFO already in. Nodding. HR, eyes down, like they knew something heavy had just begun. CEO joined last, voice crisp. "We're not here to revisit what happened. That's done. We're here to make sure it never happens again." He turned to me. "You're the only one who treated contract structure like a live wire. For that, we're grateful. And frankly, we need it institutionalized." "Wait, what?" "Effective immediately," he continued. "We want to migrate entity oversight to a dedicated internal function, built by someone who's already proven they understand where liability lives." He looked at me. "You interested?" I blinked. "You want me to?" "Build it, define it, own it." I didn't answer right away. Not out of doubt, but out of recognition. I'd been fighting for boundaries. Now I was being asked to design them. I nodded, slow, firm. "Under one condition," I said. "My entity remains separate, protected." CEO smiled. "Non-negotiable." And just like that, the contracts no longer lived in a corner of my drive. They lived at the core of a new department, forged from fire. The memo dropped on Monday at 9:02 a.m. sharp. No teasers, no Slack leaks, just a subject line. Entity Compliance and Contract Governance, New Division Announcement. My name sat third line down, centered, bolded. Director, Entity and Attribution Integrity. They gave me a title that didn't exist before, because the problem hadn't been acknowledged before. But it existed now, and so did the paper trail. Reactions came fast. A DM from finance. Finally, someone who gets it. A thumbs up emoji from legal. And from HR, a quiet note. "Appreciate the way you handled things. Quiet strength isn't always rewarded, but this time it was noticed." That one stuck with me, because it hadn't felt like strength in the moment. It felt like clenching every part of myself not to yell when the system looked away. But now the system had to look through me. At 11:27 a.m., a new name popped up in my inbox. Alana R., VP Client Growth. Subject, Introduction and Congratulation. Also, one quick question. I clicked, cautious. The body read, "Congrats on the new role. Long overdue. I've got a client structure question, and I think you're the only one who'll actually know how to answer it right." That line? That was it. Validation wasn't loud. It came in small acknowledgments that you'd quietly carried what others fumbled. And now, they trusted your hands. Still, beneath the new respect, there was dust to clean. Trent had left behind threads, assumptions, and one last tangle. At 2:03 p.m., my assistant pinged. "Hey, flagged something odd. One of the contracts from Q2 last year lists dual entities. Want me to loop legal? I pulled the file and froze, because in the footer, below the legalese, sat a string of metadata that shouldn't exist, modified by T. Martin, _ ghost draft date, July 7th time, 11:46 p.m. It was an altered copy, made after hours, never submitted, never legal. I picked up the phone. "Hey," I said to Maya in internal affairs. "I think we've got one more thread to pull." She sighed, the good kind. "I was hoping you'd say that." The ghost draft wasn't just a fluke, it was a pattern. By noon the next day, I'd surfaced 3 more contracts with metadata pointing to the same alias. T. Martin _ ghost draft. Always late-night edits, always small changes, client entity renamed, delivery terms blurred, signatories swapped. None of them made it through legal. None of them matched the signed copies. But here's the thing, they were still in circulation. One had even been attached to a vendor onboarding last quarter. Trent hadn't just tried to claim ownership. He'd quietly tried to rewrite it. I compiled everything into a single document. Unauthorized modifications, summary, and forensics. Screenshots, metadata, comparisons line by line. It read like a crime scene report. Because it was. I sent it straight to Maya. BCC'd legal. Subject: urgent, potential fabrication and system breach. She replied in under 5 minutes. Got it. Pausing all strategic expansion handovers immediately. Do not escalate further until internal briefing. We'll call you in. At 4:40 p.m., I got the invite. Private Zoom. Participants: Maya, CIO, legal counsel, and, surprisingly, the CEO. When the camera flicked on, no one smiled. "This just moved past HR," Maya began. The CIO took over. "There's now evidence that secure documentation protocols were bypassed. That's not just internal, that's reportable." Legal leaned in. "If any of these ghost drafts were submitted to partners, that's exposure." CEO didn't say anything, he just looked at me. Not for blame, for next steps. I cleared my throat. "I suggest we run a full audit on Strategic Expansion's document access logs. Backdate to April last year. Isolate all off-hour edits. I'll help identify authentic versions." Legal nodded. "And the board?" CEO finally spoke. "We don't go to them with problems, we go with solutions." Then to me, "Can you build the solution?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, but I'll need full sandbox access and data retention support." "You'll have it." And just like that, the damage turned into blueprint. After the call, I sat back, screens dimmed, Slack notifications buzzed again. I wasn't chasing shadows anymore. Now I was building light around the places they used to hide. By the end of the week, the walls started shifting. Not physically, but operationally. Systems that had been ignored for years suddenly had rules. Access logs that used to auto-delete were now archived. Slack channels gained compliance observers, and for the first time in my tenure, contract ownership was no longer a footnote in ops meetings. It was a headline. Because Trent's ghost drafts weren't just bad judgment, they were a liability, and the company knew it. Monday morning, 8:12 a.m. A new policy memo landed across all departments. Policy 9.3, Entity Attribution and Contractual Chain of Custody. Effective immediately, all contracts must be verified through approved entity channels. Any deviation from time-stamped origin files will trigger automatic review. There it was, the thing I'd fought for, in whispers, screenshots, and polite corrections. Now it was printed in bold. At 10:35 a.m., the CIO sent a direct message. Audit complete. We traced 11 ghost drafts. 3 reached vendors. All contained manipulated entity info. Internal Affairs is preparing final report. Then another ping, seconds later. Also, we're shutting down strategic expansion, folding roles into product and finance. Clean slate. Strategic expansion, gone, not rebranded, not reassigned, erased. At 1:14 p.m., I was called into a final internal debrief. Maya led it. Legal and HR flanked her. The room had that weight again, the gravity of people who've seen systems nearly snap. "We wanted to thank you," Maya said, "not just for protecting the company, but for not letting power rewrite truth." She slid a document across the table. New role proposal, larger scope, budget, and something no one had offered before: autonomy. That night, I walked past the glass wall where Trent used to sit. It was empty, chair pushed in, like no one had ever tried to erase 38% of our revenue and pretend it was his. But I knew, and more importantly, the system did now too. The first official meeting of the Entity Integrity Office started quietly. No fanfare, just a long table, 4 laptops, 2 interns nervously sipping coffee, and a giant screen displaying a single slide. "We don't control ownership. We respect it." That was the motto. Not for branding, for survival. Because if there's one thing I'd learned, it's this: people will fight harder for the illusion of control than for truth itself. The interns had questions, sharp ones. Why wasn't this caught earlier? What stopped legal from flagging the ghost drafts? How did Trent get away with it for so long? I answered every one of them, calmly, not because I wasn't angry, but because I was done carrying that anger alone. By week's end, we rolled out the first system changes: entity audit dashboard, real-time contract comparison tool, access log heat maps to flag edits after hours, and buried deep in the policy packet, a clause I insisted on. All contributors retain default attribution unless formally waived in writing. It was one line, but it protected everything I used to defend through silence. 3 weeks later, Alana from Client Growth circled back. Subject: a favor, but also a thank you. She attached a draft from her team, a new enterprise deal, messy with conflicting clauses, and a client trying to push ownership into gray areas. I reviewed it line by line, left notes, cleaned the entity block, returned it within the hour. Her reply was one word: Crystal. On a rainy Thursday, I passed the CEO in the hallway. He stopped, hand on the glass railing, and said, "You know, there's a version of this story where you left. Let them take it. Start fresh somewhere else." I shrugged. "There's also a version where they won. I just didn't pick that one." He smiled, then walked off. At my desk, I opened my laptop, searched Oryx LLC, clicked the folder. The contracts were still there. Same timestamps, same signatures, still mine, still clean. And now, they weren't just protected, they were policy. 3 months later, I got a calendar invite I wasn't expecting. Subject: Q1 Executive Sync, Attribution Retrospective. From CEO's Office Time. Friday, 4 p.m. Retrospectives are usually dull. PowerPoint, passive nodding, someone mispronounces due diligence, and we all pretend to care. But this invite felt different, because in parentheses, under the subject line, it said, Oryx Case Study, Ownership versus Control. They weren't reviewing a quarter, they were reviewing me. The room was full, not just execs, board observers, 2 external legal advisors, even someone from compliance I'd never seen before. I stood at the front, pulse calm but steady. Clicked to slide 1. What happens when the drive doesn't match the entity? A few eyebrows raised. That was the point. I told them everything, not the drama, the decisions. How one VP's assumption nearly exposed us to legal risk. How small edits at 11:46 p.m. nearly triggered vendor breaches. How silence almost rewrote ownership, and how structure stopped it. I ended with a simple frame. We didn't win because we reacted. We won because the system finally had the truth in writing. The room went quiet. Afterward, the CEO walked over. No big speech, just a line. You built something bigger than you, and quieter than Trent ever was. Then he added, "We're retiring his title next quarter." That was the final page, not vengeance, closure. That night, I logged into Drive one last time, not out of fear, out of habit, clicked into Oryx LLC to archived contracts, all 42 files, timestamps untouched, ownership intact, system intact, and me? Unmoved, but never invisible again.